was going to talk on some other subject actually. I was going to talk on a Patanjali Yoga Sutra today. Then yesterday I saw this very interesting quotation from Ramana Mahrishi. It was so fabulous that it just captured my attention, and I just stopped what I was doing and thought about it for about 20 minutes. And the quotation was, "Silence is the truth of language, words are the obstacles." And it resonated very deeply with me because the meditation we do in our lineage, our parampara, is a silent meditation. And that causes lots of people to have lots of questions. They want guidance, they want music, they want things to meditate on, they want mantras to chant and remember. And Ramana Maharishi also used to refuse to do all that. In fact, what he does and what we do, it is the same yogic process. It is called Sannidhi, which basically the person leading the meditation opens himself up to the force, to the Shakti, becomes a hollow bamboo and allows the force to flow through him to the group. Depending on your receptivity, you can assimilate. But Ramana went one step further, and he actually said that speaking creates clutter. Speaking creates obstacles. Speaking creates misunderstandings and miscommunicating, because while we all share certain assumptions about words and what they mean, at a very different level or a very unique level, each person has their own interpretation of the meaning of a word. No two people ever mean exactly the same thing by a word, unless it's something simple like blue. And even over there are multiple shades. Yes, there is, so what he was saying was that if you want the authentic transmission of Shakti, then it is much easier to do so by not speaking. In fact, much better to do so by not speaking. The minute you speak, you have brought clutter, you have brought assumptions, you have brought cultural conditionings, you have brought personal experiences. So in each one of these cases, you have set up a certain barrier or a certain filter or a certain negation. So he was regularly asked, "Maharishi, why don't you speak? Why don't you teach? Why don't you have a system?" And he was like, "What makes you think that I am not teaching? What makes you think that I am not speaking? But that which I am speaking silently is much more powerful." Now, in the Jain tradition, it is well understood that when the Tirthankar comes to his highest level, then there is one school which says after that he does not perform any more karma. He just basically stands still. But of his body, this whole wave and particles of teaching flow out, and then he has these 12 people who can step down, like a step down transformer. They can interpret the teaching that is flowing off the body, and then that becomes various schools of theology, or that becomes various instructions for meditation. It's a very clear thing. Now, Ramana actually confirmed that. He actually confirmed that the best teaching flows silently in this energy format from the body. And there was a person, a very great rishi, very great person in his own right, called Ganpati Muni, and he actually could hear or tune into the teaching that used to flow out of Ramana, and he has preserved a lot of the silent teaching. He has preserved a lot of what this, the flow, that's what it's called. It's called the flow. So it was very clear, but then I thought a bit about it and I realized that even the Zen tradition or the Chinese Taoist tradition, even they are very wary of words. Even they are very, very doubtful that words can communicate authentic reality. Words can help you to reach the true self. Now we are Indians, we are intoxicated with language and with words. We love to talk, we love to hear, we love to make elaborate systems, we like to make commentaries. But the Chinese and the Japanese used to be rather, what do we call it, doubtful about it. Now one of the most famous Taoist masters, or what used to be called Taoist masters, was a man called Chuangzi, and he was a very funny, very humorous kind of person in his own right. And he once called his disciples and said, "I am in trouble." And they asked him, "Why do you say so?" And he said, "Last night I had a dream that I was a butterfly." So it was very nice. And they said, "So why is that a problem?" He said, "Now that I'm awake, I'm wondering if a butterfly is not dreaming that I am Chuangzi." So his dilemma was, am I Chuangzi dreaming that I am a butterfly, or is my whole life just the dream of a butterfly? So how can we say that any one is more valid than the other? Now this of course is that teaching tool of paradox that they use. They give these little what were called koans. They give these little puzzles which basically you cannot come to any kind of understanding from a logical or a reasonable or even a language point of view, the literal meaning of the words or the literal. So this, but the point is later on he also preferred not to speak. He also preferred to speak as little as possible, and he has formulated what is probably one of the most famous sentences in Chinese culture, where he went on this rant against words and how words are the wretched rubble and refuse of the mind, and, then, and how they get in the way of genuine communication, and how words prevent you from recognizing your authentic true self. And so finally he said this very, very famous line, which comes back to the point about what Ramana said, that he said, "Where can I find a man who has forgotten words so that I may speak with him?" So it's that authentic communication is not possible at a verbal dimension. Now, even in the Jain tradition, there is a very famous story that Mahavira actually met Buddha once, and they didn't talk to each other. Both the disciples were expecting, both sides the disciples were expecting one huge explosion of theological debate and argument, and they just stood and looked at each other for about 45 or 44 minutes, and whatever had to be communicated was communicated in that silent, and both of them went away saying, "Yes, the other person knows, the other person has realized." So the Buddhists don't have any mention. The Jains, of course, have gone and retrofitted every important episode in Indian culture, and they have a version of it themselves. But they have this, and it was very interesting that they did not use any theological arguments. They did not. They just said there was this 44-minute silent communication between the two people. So this, the more I think about it, the more I realize that how all spiritual traditions value this. You know, the Muni, the Rishi who keeps silent, the person who takes the vow of silence, because whatever you can say about your realization is incomplete, is imperfect. So it is preferable to keep quiet. Whatever you wish to communicate is being communicated in an imperfect medium, which is language, which will be interpreted according to the level of development of the person hearing it. And then God only knows how he will twist it and mistranslate it or miscommunicate it to somebody else. So the authentic teachings therefore were always silent teachings, or therefore were always at an energy level. And that is what Ramana used to keep hammering away at. That all that you really need to do is the Atma Vichara, Jnana, who am I? You need to keep eliminating And speaking, though of course he did speak a lot for a person who refused to, in the end, his disciples forced him. So there is a lot of written text about what Ramana has said. But he never thought that was the best way to teach. He never thought that was the most authentic. And even the Greeks, people you wouldn't normally think were very mystical, they were very philosophical, but even they had a mystical tradition. They had what amounts to a yoga, and one of their very core spiritual principles was what was called euphemism, which meant the pleasant sound, the holy sound. And that pleasant sound or that holy sound was to keep quiet. The most spiritual or the most pleasant or the most holy thing that you could do, the best speech is the speech where you keep quiet. So that is why they used to value, laconic speech. Laconia was part of Sparta, and they were very famous. They were very famous for speaking as little as possible. They held that people who speak too much are uncivilized. And in our culture, the sutras, people who would write the sutras, things for meditation, they say they would rather kill their son than add one unnecessary word. So this thing of brevity, but the Laconians were very famous because once Philip of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great, met them and he ordered them to surrender, and he gave them this very long list of terrible tortures he would visit upon them. And he gave it, they had the rhetorical style in Greece, it was very famous. So part of the way the message was delivered, and the messages would always be delivered verbally, it wouldn't be delivered written down. So somebody trained in rhetoric would deliver. So one of them went and delivered, if the Macedonians attack, then you will be sold into slavery. If the Macedonians attack you, your cities will be burned. If the Macedonians attack you, so they heard all that, and this went on for a good 25 minutes. It's a very lovely, beautiful, well-crafted speech. And they gave what was the most famous answer of the ancient world. They said, if. That is the ultimate Laconian speech. That is why when somebody speaks very briefly, we call it Laconian speech, because this was their only answer, if. So, but the concept of euphemism for the Greeks, to speak well, the rhetorician was very highly valued. The person who could speak beautifully, the person who could speak persuasively, the person who could speak cogently, the person who could convert somebody to his point of view. But the person who knew how to hold his tongue was valued most of all. The person who could keep absolutely quiet was valued most of all. And that is why the being silent was called the euphemism. In fact, the very word euphemism means what is unpleasant, we find a pleasant word for it. Yeah, that is the meaning of euphemism. No? When we don't want to say that somebody died, we say that they passed away. Yeah, because death, to say that somebody died is a little harsh. Or we don't like to say that somebody is a cripple, we say that they are physically challenged. Yeah, these are all euphemisms, these are all pleasant ways. So, to speak pleasantly is of course very important. All spiritual traditions insist upon that, because you can wound people very terribly by speaking harsh words. So they insist upon that, not as a compulsory factor, but a thing to maintain. Though of course yogis are very different there from everybody else, because the yogis become very hard. So yogis have never really liked this, but it's part of the tradition. In the bhakti tradition, of course, it's very big. Speak pleasantly. The yogis were always truth above all. Pleasantness dekha jayega. So they were never very great people for that. But they did believe that the transmission of power can happen only in a non-verbal way. So that is the reason why this whole process we do, Sannadhi. Sannadhi basically means this treasure or this presence. the treasure of presence. When you sit with the master, or you sit with the person who can open himself up to the force, allow it to flow into the group, then that process is called Samadhi. It is the oldest and most powerful form of yogic meditation. It's different from dhyana and dharana and darshana and all those other things, because those are all specific purposes and they are much more limited. This is direct access, mainlining from the source. It is directly sending the force into the group. So it's not an entertaining process, but over time it is the most powerful process. It's because Ramana Mahrishi, the kind of people he touched and transformed and the kind of people they became, it was quite extraordinary to see. But the Greeks took this to such an extent, and even our temples, in our temples when we are doing the arti, the arti when we are worshipping the murti with the fire. What do we do simultaneously with that? We ring our bells as loudly as possible. Yes, we make this tremendous racket. Yeah. Why do we make that racket? It is deliberately a racket. Because when the arti is being done, the murti is getting charged. At that moment, if somebody says something unpleasant, that vibration will go into the murti. We don't want that vibration to go. We want, so you drown out all other sounds with the sound of the bell. And of course, if you use a Tibetan bell or even any ordinary bell, it's a very transformatory sound. It's a sound that, because again, this all comes from Laya Yoga. Laya Yoga means rhythm yoga, the yoga of rhythm. All Kundalini Yoga is actually it's a mistake to call it Kundalini Yoga. It's actually Laya Yoga, the yoga of rhythm, the yoga of vibration, the yoga of waves. So sound we know comes in a wave. Yeah, so sound is part of the laya. We create a laya, we create a wave of sound which drowns out anything unpleasant or anything obnoxious that might be articulated, so that nothing goes into the murti, because at the moment of the arti, the murti is very vulnerable that way. It is being energized. Now these processes are not well understood in most parts of the country. Most people do the arti because their great grandfather has done it. Now, they don't understand what the purpose of the arti is, what the purpose of ringing the bell is. But the Greeks used to do the same thing. They used to make this tremendous din when the rituals were being conducted. So even when now the Ganpati Pandal is all up there, and when the Pushpanjali or the arti is being done, they beat the drums very loudly. And we get very upset. What a noise they are making, what a racket they are making. If you ask them, they won't be able to tell you why. But this is the reason why they are doing it. This euphemism, the holy sound, they want that sound of, but of course it would be best if you could do it, if you could convince everybody not to speak, that would be best. If you could have everybody in the temple, everybody in the congregation, knowing what human beings are like, it is better to ring the bells and beat the drums, so that is why in congregations always this sound becomes so important. But that is not the purpose, and especially in a place like Ramana's ashram, where if you go there, you automatically become silent. You see people, it's quite fun to see. People are coming up to the gate, they are chatting, even a little bit into the gate. And then suddenly there is like a cut-off point and everything, the sound level, the decibel level, everything. It just goes down. That's because the sheer energy residue of the man, the presence of Ramana is so strong that the silence automatically happens, the euphemism automatically happens. So it is quite an extraordinary thing. Plus they burn an eternal flame over them, which he had lit, and they don't let it go out. So that also creates a lot of difference in the energy. It creates a lot. Even small children, they just, it's magic, they just calm down and become quiet. So that multiple understanding, why in Laya Yoga silence was so important, why the transition cannot happen, the transmission of Shakti cannot happen if you are speaking. The minute you speak, the whole vibration gets disturbed. Speech actually disturbs the prana, So if you keep quiet, the prana is stronger than if you than if you speak. So there are these multiple complex. Now, Ramana was very old school, so he didn't want to say all these inner things, why I don't speak, why I don't. He would just say, this is the best method, this is the best method. And he was also of the school that let people discover on their own. But today, we don't need to be so strict, because if we leave people to their own devices, they'll never come to it. It's better that they understood. And the reason why I spoke is because in our system, all the time this one question remains. Why silent? Why no mantra? Why no guidance? Why no explanation? Why silent? Just sitting still. But it's about stillness. Not to speak is verbal stillness. Not to move is physical stillness. Not to think is mental stillness. Not to let your emotions go all over the place. So the whole posture school of yoga is about you hit the perfect posture, your body is still, your mind is still, your emotions are still, your key is still, you are enlightened. That's the whole. the minute you achieve the minute you achieve stillness in all four dimensions, you are enlightened. And for Ramana, the being quiet was the most important thing. And it's a cliche actually. You read accounts of people's meeting with Ramana and they all say the same thing. We came with 1,000 questions in our mind and we sat over there. Sometimes they would have the courage to ask him, he would just look at them and not say anything. And then in 15-20 minutes, this oceanic calm would descend upon them, and then they no longer have any questions. And when they go home, they find that somehow they have been answered. And he was insisting that if I answer verbally, it would not work. It would not hit them, it would not impact them. So that is the reason why I don't speak. Though, like I said, harassment from disciples is a constant. So they would constantly force him to write things, say things, do things. But he didn't like it. He never ever liked it. He preferred to be in the euphemism.